I'm Shannon Moore, and this is Formation. Over the next few weeks here on the podcast, we are visiting with some local leaders and leaders from beyond our community to talk about the Love Your Neighbor initiative that is going on here at UCC. I hope that you will join us for these very special episodes. Welcome to Formation, a weekly podcast from University Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas, where every week I sit down with someone and we talk about faith. Today I have with me, I guess I could call you a good friend.
If you must.
If I must. Reverend Peter Mitchell. You are the senior minister at the First Christian Church in McKinney.
That is correct, just up 121.
And thank you for being here. We're going to be talking about our Love Your Neighbor campaign that's going on right now in a little bit. But first, I want to ask you to tell me a little bit about your faith formation, your childhood faith. What did that look like?
I grew up in a disciples church in a river town in Iowa. Keokuk, Iowa. That is correct. And
it's on the Mississippi River.
It is right on the Mississippi, where the Mississippi and the Des Moines rivers come together. And if either river had shifted a couple hundred years ago, Keokuk is an island.
Oh, okay.
But alas, it is still part of a state connected. I grew up in an all-hands-on-deck kind of church. What I didn't realize was it was just the church you knew. I didn't know that it was a large church for most Disciples of Christ churches.
And this is a small town,
This
right?
is small town, yeah. This is a town of probably about 12,000 at the time when I was growing up. But it was an all-hands-on-deck church. There was a lot of lay involvement, the idea, there were associate ministers off and on, but it was really like there was a pastor, who was my dad.
I was about to say, I think there was a connection with you.
Yes, there's a reason that I went to that church. And there was church staff, lay church staff that would work there in program ways. But it was a long time until I think it was in high school before the church had like a called ordained associate minister like a lot of larger churches would have. And so I think because of that staffing structure, I can kind of see through the historical lens of now working in church for 20 plus years, that because of that staffing structure, it really it was an all hands on deck. And so we had our friends' parents teaching a Sunday school and organizing mission and outreach events and fellowship stuff in a way that was all very communal. And so, my formation as an understanding of church was that you got to do it. Somebody's got to do it.
There's no question. It was just something that you do.
Yeah, it was just part of life. And your people at church were your people at school, were your there was one middle school and one high school.
Okay.
And so everybody you knew from church, you also knew at school and football games Friday nights and other civic organizations. There was no escaping anyone, and so community was not an option. It was just your life.
Sounds pretty ideal. Would you?
Yeah, it's interesting. My kids recently, because I grew up in the 1900s.
My nephew says that too.
My kids recently asked me about what did you like most about growing up? And, I don't know if I knew it at the time, but just it was very idyllic. It was small town. We were everywhere on our bikes. Church was just a very organic part of everybody's life in a very sort of leave it to beaver sort of way that really doesn't exist in a lot of communities anymore. But yeah, it was great. It was wonderful.
Now and I hope you remember telling this story, but it's one of my favorite stories of yours, where you had asked your dad not to tell stories about you. Will you share that?
So I at some point in my childhood was the subject of a story told by my dad from the pulpit in a sermon. And I was like, no way. So I made it known, you cannot do that anymore. So then, as an act of spite, which just is totally in line with my dad, the next Sunday preached about Peter, the biblical figure. And the first time the name came out of his mouth, I was just livid. And it took me a little bit to figure out that it was not me and that I was being played. And you know,
Well played, Rev
yeah,
Mitchell.
was it appropriate to use your like pastoral platform to like troll your son? I can't say yes or no, but I can say that as now a preacher, I would probably have done the exact same thing.
So, tell me how you went from preacher's kid to minister. What was that? Do you have a sense of that? How that call happened?
So a couple of things. I had like a, you know, as a teenager, had like kind of a clear like sense of like call in like sort of a spiritual moment.
Did that happen at camp? I'm
it did.
Curious because I know you were big.
Oh yeah, no, it
kid.
happened at church camp, but I would say that sort of, I wouldn't say that it fizzled, but it just took on other dynamics as I approached college. And so I went to college thinking that I was going to be either a music teacher or a history teacher, and started off
TCU, right?
over here in some of the weed out classes in the education department at TCU, and those courses did their job. And I became a communication studies major with no real plan other than, you know, a lot of people were pharmaceutical reps or like found marketing jobs, or I was like, okay, I'll do something. I was just sort of like, you know, not, this may shock you, I was not planning very far in advance. And I just knew college was fun and I liked living in Texas, and so that's what I was doing. And then you and I started working together, kind of by happenstance. I was an upperclassman at TCU and became the very part-time Cairo youth minister at Central Christian Church, which is middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
And this was in Weatherford.
At Central Christian Church in Weatherford. And that was just like, well, it's easy, it's fun, whatever. And then I just sort of like backed into it. Like I didn't know that, you know, I was working at church. It came to me pretty naturally. I seemed to enjoy it. I worked with great people, with some exceptions. And, you know, it just sort of happened. And I worked there for 6 years. And then my roommate in college, who was also a disciple student, applied for seminary and got in at Bright. And I was like, I mean, I got to do something next year. And I don't know, it'd be, you know, it's a more interesting question, I think, if you were to ask my wife, who I was dating and engaged to at that time.
You dated all through
college, yeah. And so I would imagine she has a different telling of the story in terms of like what I suspect in hindsight are her anxieties about my complete lack of direction.
But what I also know about her is she sets her mind on something.
Oh, she knew what I was going to do.
So she knew.
Yes. Yes, she had a plan.
I will say that. Okay, so you get married, you get ordained, then you leave Texas.
I did. We spent 12 years in Iowa, our Iowa diaspora, and it was actually quite lovely. I had decided it was time to move home to help kind of take care of some family stuff, help take care of my mom, and so we were there for 12 years. I worked at one church for an entire 22 months as the pastor, just outside of Des Moines. I was not cut out for solo pastor, very small town life. And so then we spent 10 years in Marion, Iowa, which is effectively Cedar Rapids, and was the pastor of the Christian church there, and it was outstanding. Had both of our kids there, wonderful community to be a part of, fabulous, like growing, dynamic, exciting church, and really enjoyed it.
Did it remind you of the church in Keokuk that you were when you were growing up? Was it similar?
You know, perhaps. I guess I hadn't thought of that until you described that now, but yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it was a very all-hands-on-deck church, a lot of lay involvement, and it was a church, too, that had bounced back and forth over the years of kind of teetering on that budget and church size of, do we have a full-time ordained minister? Do we have a lay program director kind of thing? And so it did kind of alternate between those staffing structures over the years. And so, yeah, I guess in hindsight, it does have a lot of similarity to that church I grew up in.
What brought you back to Texas?
I don't know if you're familiar with winter.
Not very.
You know what? This is a little fun fact, University Christian Church. I took Shannon sledding for the first time ever when you were 40?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. You had seen snow, right, and interacted
Yeah,
with snow.
we had, but we didn't have a lot of snow where I grew up, and certainly don't here, and we didn't have big hills.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was my first time.
Oh, it was awesome. You happened to be in Iowa for some reason in December. And so it was...
It was your wife's birthday.
It was my wife's birthday. And it snowed like son of a gun, and then we went sledding, and it was fabulous.
The thing I remember most about that is your oldest, Caroline, was, I don't know, she was young.
Probably 4 or 5.
At that point. And it started snowing, which for me is like magic. And so I looked out the window and I said, Caroline, it's snowing. She's like, ugh.
It's always
snowing.
Yeah, so that's what brought us back to Texas, was that, and quite honestly, seasonal affective disorder is a very real thing, especially in that part of the world. It is gray from like Halloween until May, and it is oppressive. Like, it just brings you down. I grew up in it, and so I didn't think about it moving back there because it was such an ordinary part of my life. But the interesting thing about it is that it's not just that it happens to an individual, it happens collectively. Like, everybody by about February is just in kind of a bad mood.
Like your whole family, your whole church.
Everybody
your
at
whole
church,
community.
everybody, like, don't hold an important church meeting in February in Iowa. Like, everybody's just sick of it. So they need some sunshine. And, but the other interesting thing is that I believe too, I'm not a researcher, I think it's cumulative. It's one thing to do it 1 winter, 2 winters, 5 winters, but especially when we had moved from Texas, we get a dozen years in, that 12th is like, man alive. And I should also say, I would be remiss not to point out, also the Spirit of God moved. And
there's that.
I had spent an incredible 10 years serving this church, leading them through changes. We added a worship service to the Sunday morning schedule. The church grew pretty substantially. We did a lot of things that were so wonderful that I'm like excited by and proud of. And at the same time, about 9 years in, I felt like this weird, it wasn't discontent. It certainly wasn't dissatisfaction. I just didn't know what it was. It was just very ill at ease, and I couldn't figure it out. And I would talk about it with my wife, and I'm like, something just feels weird. I don't know what it is. Nothing's wrong. No one's mad at me. They're not chasing me out with pitchforks and torches. I just couldn't figure it out. This is where it's important to point out that the church I grew up in, my dad was the pastor of that church for 26 years, and I never moved as a minister's kid. And so I had no concept in my brain or in my spirit that God might be calling me to go serve elsewhere.
Right.
So I finally figured it out. And I go to my wife, hat in hand. I'm about to tell her that, like, hey, I'm going to upheave our entire life here. Like, we're going to sell our house. We're going to move to wherever is next. We're going to buy a house. You're going to leave your job that you love. We're going to, like, have to go establish this whole new life. And I'm just like, we'd been married for 15 years at that point. And I'm trying to, ease into this very big thing. And she goes, oh, well, yeah, of course. I knew that. And I was like, what do you mean you knew that? She was like, oh, yeah, I've known that for a while. I was like, you could have told me.
It's sort of like at the end of The Wizard of Oz. You could have gone home anytime you wanted to.
Right, yeah. And she she's a very thoughtful, spiritual person of faith. She was like, that was not my information to tell you. That was yours to figure out. Because she is also a minister's kid. Right. And moved twice as a kid and just understood our life as a minister's family differently than I did because of our different families of origin. So, all right. Yeah. So then that's what brought us back to, ironically, interestingly, I was on my way to the airport to fly to Fort Worth for a meeting. It was January of 2020. By the way, June of 2020, great time to move cross country. Oh, yeah. Yeah, very simple, easy, no complicating factors. I was on my way to the airport to fly to Fort Worth to this very church to attend a meeting of some other pastors. And while I was driving to the airport, I got a phone call from someone who was handling search and call. in the Southwest region of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, who said, I am going to meet with the search committee of First Christian Church in McKinney. I'm going to be taking your profile. Well, I have it here. I'm going to take it with me. I just wanted to let you know that that was going to happen. And I said, oh, great. I appreciate the heads up. Loosely familiar with that church, but, cool. Have at it. Hang up the phone, call my wife, and I said, just letting you know I got this call, but we are absolutely not moving to McKinney. I was also absolutely not moving to Marion, Iowa, where I lived for 10 years. So
the Spirit will do that to you.
It's the worst.
Well, look, we're going to take a break, and then we will come back and continue this conversation with Peter Mitchell.
Hi, I'm Russ Peterman, Senior Minister of University Christian Church Disciples of Christ here in Fort Worth. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that keeps me up at night is the division that I see in our nation. And as this 2024 election cycle heats up, communities and neighborhoods are going to become even more divided, less kind, more polarized than we already are, maybe more than we've ever been. But at UCC, we believe that Jesus offers a better way of engaging one another. He calls us to love our neighbors and to actively embody kindness. You see, we believe that as a church, we need to be active in bringing our community together. And so we're going to do just that with a church-wide grassroots campaign that we are calling Love Your Neighbor. And this neighborhood movement will focus on actively modeling kindness, working towards inclusive community, and doing all that we can to undo polarization. So I hope you'll join us in this movement, because in a time filled with negativity, we all have a choice to make. We can choose to love our neighbors. And if we do that, we will have accomplished more than just making it through an election. You see, we have the power and the courage to make our neighborhoods, our community, our nation, look even more like the kingdom of God.
We are back continuing our conversation with Reverend Peter Mitchell. Peter, as I mentioned earlier, something that we are doing here at University Christian Church during this season of election angst and preparing for this
Familiar with it?
Very, contentious time in our lives as Americans. We are launching a Love Your Neighbor campaign. Who said love your neighbor? Was that Abraham Lincoln? RuPaul. It was Jesus, I think.
He also, yes, he has been credited.
So we are trying to just get the word out in some subtle ways as people see election campaign signs and that sort of thing. Just a little reminder that we're all neighbors, that we're all connected. We don't have to always be at each other's throats. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you think we as Christians can do to live into this idea of loving our neighbor? What does it mean, and how do we do it?
Well, I think a lot of the times when I'm trying to process, by the way, that's not a simple question, but when I'm trying to process a question like that, everybody goes to their own places in the scriptures, their kind of home base. I always am drawn back to the Sermon on the Mount and drawn back to Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, because I feel like it's just this field guide to, okay, here's what this might actually look like. And, Jesus goes back and forth, especially early in the Sermon on the Mount, between very comforting, pastoral, like blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. And so it kind of alternates between these very comforting pastoral things and then also these very just direct, sorry, deal with it, kind of like you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth.
Nothing you can do about it.
Yep, no option. You just are, and and difficult challenges to love your enemy, to pray for those who persecute you. But there's this alternating back and forth that I see in this model of Jesus preaching there, which. So I think when it comes, so that's my home base, so to speak, in the scriptures, and so in terms of loving our neighbor, I think. that we're well served to remember that it never looks just one way, and it never requires the exact same thing every time. And we can have space to be more assertive in that practice, you know, and sort of like really leaning into those directives and those declarations from Jesus, like you are the light of the world, deal with it. And at the same time, I think there are moments in loving our neighbor where we can pause, step back, because, you know, the follow-up to love your neighbor is as yourself. And so I think that part of loving our neighbor is that alternation between, is that a word?
It is now.
Alternatification between those, you know, more direct acts of relationship and care and listening and being present, but then also being able to step back to those places of sort of pastoral connection with the Spirit of God, because some of what we're doing when we're loving our neighbor is very counterintuitive, and we are not doing it on our own power. And so that's why I like that model of Jesus, who goes, okay, blessed are, you can do it, I believe in you, here's the Spirit of God present with you, and now get out there, go, you know.
I think also so many times there's an idea that loving your neighbor means changing your neighbor.
Or liking your neighbor.
Right.
Like, that we're all on the same page. Yeah, that we've changed into some sort of monolith. Yeah.
And it's not that. I mean,
no.
It can't be.
I think that's why God gave us biological families.
Say more.
Or families of origin, like the people we're related to, for however we're related to them. You got to learn to love people you don't like. Not that any of us are related to people we don't like, but you know. But I mean, I think it's a microcosm of the task before us. Is that like you're stuck with these people, you know, who are gonna annoy you or spend money in ways you wish they didn't, or you know, support political candidates that you disagree with, but you're related to them. They're part of your family. How do you love them in spite of the fact that maybe you don't like them? And we figure that out in fits and spurts, and we're not always good at it. But
and that also can translate to a church family, to worship alongside someone that is.
See, and I would go back to the conversation that we had about the church of my upbringing. There were like 6 churches to go to. You did not have a choice to like get away from anyone. And now I think we live, especially, you know, in this part of the world, in Texas, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a church that you could go to. And so, like, it's so easy for us to opt out. It's so easy for us to find a church that meets every social, cultural, political assumption we carry, that then we can go, we're nice and comfortable here. I like the preaching because every time he says something, it's something I already think, you know, or every time that Sunday school teacher or that Sunday school classmate or small group member, you know, talks, I'm hearing what I like. And it's easy to curate in sort of a church environment like we live in this part of the world. And I do think I learned a lot about loving my neighbor growing up in Iowa, which was at the time a swing state, could have gone any way in an election. But that also meant like you just sort of assumed and moved on from the fact that there were people at your church or in your Sunday school class that voted differently than you, you know, held different sort of understandings of politics or the role of the government or whatever. And yeah, you were like, oh man, don't talk to Steve about that. You know, you just save your, don't get into it. He loves a soapbox. But that same guy is the person who everyone calls when they need to borrow some woodworking tools.
Right.
You know, and so we just didn't have an option. And I feel like that's a challenge that we face, is that, and social media certainly doesn't help this, is our ability to curate our lives to the specificities that we like. I mean, certainly we don't always get what we want, but in terms of the narratives in which we operate, that we can curate the voices we hear and the people we interact with.
This reminds me of a conversation I heard back at the little disciples church I was at in North Carolina before I moved here.
Mill Creek Christian Church.
Mill Creek Christian Church. We were looking for a preacher, and one woman said, well, if we don't get a good preacher, I'm going to have to go to another church. And there was this older woman, very wise, very funny lady too. but she just looked so confused, and she said, "You don't do that. This is your church, you know,
Yes.
and you just deal with whatever you have to deal with." And I've never forgotten that. I mean, it was as
Yeah.
if the other woman had said, "I'm going to go to the moon." She couldn't understand that.
Your Buick won't get you there.
Right? She didn't understand that concept of, well, if I don't like it, I'm just going to leave, because this is your family, this is your church, you know. And sometimes it is necessary to, you know, we need to put that out there too. But, you know, I think there is something very important about that work of
Yeah.
of loving, even if you don't like, as you said. And I think that's key. So, well, Peter, we're about out of time, but I really do appreciate you driving all the way from Oklahoma.
It is nearly Oklahoma. Well, listen, I look forward to coming back next week.
Oh, okay, sure. And
It's the Shannon Moore Storytelling Hour. I look forward to filling you in on all the things you long to know.
well, we'll talk about that. And I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation as well. If you'd like to share your faith story, I hope you'll email me, formation@uccftw.com. I'll get you on the red couch to share your story. Take care. Have a great week.